The Federal Reserve is now hearing and reporting about layoffs that are beginning to pop up all across the country. And that's in addition to its own measures of economic health, which have utterly collapsed over the last couple of months. If you were just to look at the state of the U.S. economy from the Federal Reserve's own data, you'd be hard-pressed not to believe that there's a full-blown recession right on the doorstep right now. Their PMIs have utterly crashed for almost every region, services as well as manufacturing. In fact, just today, the Texas Manufacturing Outlook survey from the Dallas Fed was merely the latest one to get smashed, down even more sharply and coming in at its lowest level since May of 2020. And for the Fed's estimates, we're seeing way too many of these comparisons. Last week it was Philadelphia, again, both manufacturing and services, which were even worse. As I pointed out recently, we've already got the same extreme levels in market prices and spreads and financial indications. The macro data that we're getting here is simply coming in aligned with all of those. The real danger to the economy is that it's already in the danger zone for something just like this, especially the labor market. The labor market's been right on the edge of the cliff as it is. That's what the collapsing consumer confidence numbers have been telling us for several months. So when we look at the labor curve, and yes, there is a labor curve, there's a curve for practically everything, but when we look at the labor curve, all the information we have says the economy is teetering right on that line. No wonder there have been Fed officials coming out over the last several days talking about rate cuts and maybe the need to support the economy. Their very own data shows not inflation, but an economy with a sharp loss of momentum that is experiencing potentially exactly what you would look like for one that's heading right into full-blown recession. Now we'll start here with the Beige Book, which came out a few days ago. And given the way the Federal Reserve officials have been talking about, balanced risks, and we don't know how tariffs and uncertainty, the term they keep throwing around here, which they largely mean in terms of inflation, the term itself, only showed up 8 times in the latest Beige Book here for the month of April of 2025. That compares to 14 times that inflation showed up in the Beige Book from April of 2024. You remember April of 2024, everyone was talking about an inflation scare, higher for longer back then too. So even less than last year when supposedly, at least according to Federal Reserve rhetoric and policymakers and what their speeches and what the statements they're making, inflation is supposed to be their top priority, their top concern, or one of them, and it barely even merits much mention in the Beige Book. And remember what the Beige Book is. The Beige Book is a compendium of anecdotes and stories and contact summaries that the various Fed branches get from all of the people that they talk to within their various regions. And so the Beige Book, if people are talking about inflation, the mentions of inflation are going to show up in this volume. But instead, only 8 instances. And you compare that to, say, January 2023, just coming off the worst of the supply shock, the term inflation, as you might imagine, shows up 30 times. But from the Fed's own rhetoric, you would think there'd be 30 mentions of inflation in this volume of the Beige Book. And what that says is that the Fed's contacts in the real economy, they're not concerned about inflation and prices. They're concerned instead about everything else, the downturn and the loss of economic momentum. Now, what the Beige Book did say, as far as its national summary for the employment situation, employment was little changed to up slightly in most districts, with 1 district reporting a modest increase, 4 reporting a slight increase, 4 reporting no change, and 3 reporting a slight decline. And they even admit this is a slight deterioration from the previous report, with a few more districts reporting declines. That's not a good sign. Hiring was generally slower for consumer-facing firms than for business-to-business firms as consumer confidence falls off, reflection of the labor market, and as consumer confidence falls off, the danger is it becomes a fall-off in consumer spending and therefore a fall-off of employment, and on we go into the feedback vicious cycle, which becomes the full-blown recession. The most notable declines in headcount were in government roles or roles at organizations receiving government funding. We know that, that's DOGE. Several districts reported that firms were taking a wait-and-see approach to employment, pausing or slowing hiring until there's more clarity on economic conditions. And here's the big thing. In addition, there were scattered reports of firms preparing for layoffs. And that's a change from what we've heard from the Beige Book and other sources too over the last couple of months. And it was reinforced by another mention from New York region specifically, which said Contacts at employment agencies in the region reported that labor demand and labor supply remained roughly in balance, though it has generally become easier to find workers because there's fewer people looking for workers, and there's more workers that are becoming available because they can't find jobs. Still, some businesses with more specialized needs continue to struggle to find workers with the right skills, which means they're not willing to pay the price that they need to pay in order to acquire those workers, which is another sign of economic fragility at the very least. Though there were no mentions of major layoffs, there were scattered signs of headcount reductions at smaller companies, and that's where it starts first. And as I just said, this is a deterioration just from the Beige Book data and its anecdotes about where the economy stands from all of these individual contacts in these various branches. What the Beige Book said about layoffs back a couple times ago in January, what they said back in January was, again, for the national summary, contacts across multiple sectors noted difficulty finding skilled workers, and reports of layoffs remained rare. So we went from difficulty finding workers, layoff mentions and announcements and contacts and statements were rare, to now we're seeing scattered reports of layoffs. Firms are talking about maybe we need to do something, hire less. It's gone from there's nothing to worry about to maybe there is something to worry about. It's gone from we don't believe there's anything like a recession, strong and resilient, to oh, maybe there is something behind all of this recession talk. And that's just the Beige Book. So already the indications from the Fed not looking good, instead looking for the labor market as if it may actually be transitioning from the vertical part of the beverage curve to the flat part. I mentioned in the introduction that there is a labor market or employment curve. It's called the beverage curve, and it's a useful guide for trying to figure out where the economy is as it might be heading towards something like a full-blown recession. This thing is named from William Beveridge, and it basically just measures the relative demand for workers and the relative supply. What we're interested in is the point where lower demand for labor means actually cutting back on the number of employees. That's the flat part of the beverage curve, where demand for labor has fallen off so much, employers don't just stop hiring or trimming hours, they outright start cutting employees. So on the beverage curve, the y-axis is the job openings rate, and there's a couple different ways to measure the job openings rate, which doesn't matter for our purposes here. It's basically the measure of labor demand, and it comes from JOLTS job openings, which is a problem all its own, but not really for us because job openings overstate the demand for labor, so we're taking a very conservative look at where the labor market situation is, given the information that we have. And on the x-axis, we have the unemployment rate, which is supposed to be a measure of supply, and it's good enough for a proxy for our purposes. And again, that's another one that overstates the labor market because the unemployment rate doesn't account for the lower participation, even though that's really what we're trying to measure, the level of slack in the economy, whether it's increasing or not. And so the vertical part of the beverage curve, that's the one, if you're moving down, that means lower job openings or lower job openings rate. So you're moving down the vertical part of the beverage curve, it means lower demand for labor, but not so bad that it leads to a rise in unemployment. You're still hiring enough workers to keep unemployment relatively stable at that point, and you're not seeing a whole lot of increased mass layoffs. So the vertical part of the beverage curve, you really want to stay there. But as you get lower and lower on that vertical part, you risk transitioning into the flat part. The flat part of the beverage curve, where the demand for workers gets to be so low, employers don't just stop hiring or cutting hours, they start actively firing workers. The general economy falls off so much, they don't even demand the workers that they have or the work from the workers that they have on their payrolls right now. So the lack of hiring becomes the start of firing when we go from the vertical part of the beverage curve to the flat part. So using the data that we have, as flawed as it is, as you can see, the economy has been right there in the danger zone of the beverage curve, right where it transitions from the vertical part to the flat part. And when you adjust the JOLTS job openings rate by just using, I'll just pick a million here just out of thin air, just an arbitrary number, to try to account for some of the overstatement in the job openings part of the labor demand in the y-axis, maybe get a better judge of actual labor demand. When you do that, you see we're even closer to that danger zone and maybe already onto the flat part of the beverage curve already. And what we just heard from the Beige Book and the transition from layoffs are rare in January to now there's scattered reports of layoffs, that's entirely consistent with an economy that just might be transiting from the vertical part of the beverage curve and what that really represents and to the more serious flat part where it's not just lack of hiring. Now we might actually start to see firing. That's kind of what the Beige Book was really telling us. But where that transition is just now maybe showing up as far as, the Beige Book and some of these stories and anecdotes and contact information in these Fed branches, the other Fed branch numbers, the manufacturing and services PMIs, they're not leaving anything to imagination here. They're unambiguously falling off really sharply. In fact, they're really plunging and crashing. Some of these numbers are getting really concerning, including the one we got today from the Dallas Fed and its Texas manufacturing outlook survey. That one utterly crashed, falling to minus 35.8, which is its lowest since May of 2020. As I said in the introduction, we're seeing far too many of these fall to their 2020 pandemic lows. The Texas Manufacturing Outlook PMI had been plus 14.1 back in January. So you're talking about a 50-point swing in a matter of a couple months. Huge loss of momentum, the artificial high, and it was only ever an artificial high last year. More evidence and corroboration for that. The artificial high in January all of a sudden crashes in the payback period here beginning March and now April. Minus 35.8. New orders from Dallas, minus 20. That's the second lowest since May of 2020. It had been plus 7.7 back in January too. You also see the Company Outlook Index, which is a measure of optimism from individual firms and their individual perspectives. That one dropped to minus 28.3, another post-pandemic low. All the labor market measures got weak too. While the employment index was still fairly negative at minus 3.9, the hours index slipped to minus 6.4. So you're already seeing the negative signs in the labor market as far as these PMIs are concerned. And some of the comments that accompanied the Texas survey, while they have become more positive, in fact, the Texas survey had been one of the more optimistic measures heading into the final months of last year, and the comments all reflected that. There has been a clear change in interpretation and standing and perception heading into the middle part of this year because the dramatic loss of momentum is showing up all over these various places, the regions, and these various businesses. I'll give you a couple examples. In the computer and electronic manufacturing industries down there in Texas, one comment said, we export about 20% of our production. Our largest customers are in the UK and France, but we also export to China and many other countries. We import a few raw materials, but this isn't directly significant. The current tariff negotiations are having an effect in several ways. We accelerated one order to China to beat the reciprocal tariffs. We see a lot of this front running and front loading. And we expect our China sales to go to zero until the tariff situation changes. We are seeing some European customers stock up on inventory in anticipation of future tariffs. I wonder if this is Texas Instruments. Most of our U.S. customers continue to buy, but we have seen a 25% drop in incoming RFQs, which are requests for quotations, in April compared with the average of previous months. Assuming this continues, we expect to see roughly a 10 to 15% decline in sales in May. And you got to believe that a 10 to 15% decline in sales, there's going to be some reductions in headcounts, in addition to not hiring anybody new, just as a very start. And they continue, machinery manufacturing. We believe the direction the current administration is leading our country is on target, but the pain to get there may be longer and more intense than originally anticipated. And transportation equipment. There is too much uncertainty, including a possible recession. Interest rates are too high. The Federal Reserve always seems to be late for their own party. Not that interest rates make a difference one way or the other, but you got to like the interpretation there, saying the Fed is out there saying one thing about inflation, and yet we're seeing something completely opposite. And if it was just this one company and just this one region and just this one sector of the economy, you could dismiss it and say that's just some idiosyncrasies related to Dallas and Texas. But as I keep saying, it's all over the places. It's not just manufacturing, it's also services. It's in all of these regions. In all of these regions, manufacturing and services are doing the same thing, which is utterly crash. Last week, it was Philadelphia. The Philadelphia manufacturing PMI, as well as their services one too. The Philly PMI fell to minus 26.4. It had been plus 12.5 in March. So you're talking about almost a 40-point swing just in a single month. And it had been plus 44.3 back in January. So a more than 70-point swing in 3 months. And the new orders index, minus 34.2. That had been plus 8.7 in March. So you're talking about a 40-point drop-off just in a single month. That's the payback from the artificial high. And the artificial high, as far as the Philly PMI, had been plus 42.9 back in January for a 77-point drop in just a couple months. The artificial high plus the loss of momentum, and now you're getting some deeply concerning signals. And for Philadelphia, manufacturing, their employment index fell 20 points. And while it was still positive, the direction of travel is entirely clear here. As the report stated from the Philadelphia branch of the Fed, the average workweek index fell sharply from plus 8.7 to minus 12.7. So again, more labor market difficulties in the Fed's own data. With the Dallas Fed survey for manufacturing, that gives us the average of the 5 PMIs for the month. And at minus 17.5, that's the lowest since last January. Last January was influenced by the Empire Fed and the blizzard that happened back then, very nearly matching January 2024 for what would be the worst for the average manufacturing PMI since 2020. There's that comparison again. Same thing for the average of new orders. But like I said, it's not just manufacturing. You turn over to services. The Philly Services Index absolutely crashed. Fell to minus 26.7 here in April, which is a new cycle low for that one, having been plus 1.6, the artificial high before the payback period back in January. The New York Fed Services Survey, minus 19.8. The future outlook from New York Fed Services, minus 50, which is the lowest since 2009. So if we take the average of the 5 services PMIs, we don't have the Dallas Fed Services PMI, that comes in tomorrow. But assuming the Dallas Fed Services just matches what it did last month, which was pretty negative to begin with, and there's likely deterioration there as well. But if we just assume that the Dallas Fed is the same this month as last month, the average for the 5 services PMIs comes in at minus 20.5, which is a new low for the average going back to 2020 as well. Another one. All 4 of those services PMIs deteriorated from March, and March wasn't exactly a good month because that had already deteriorated sharply from January and February. The payback period in the economy has begun, and it has begun with this shroud of concern over the labor market that keeps coming up more and more. We saw that with consumer confidence. As I talked about yesterday with Steve, consumer confidence isn't really about spending so much as it is initially perceptions of the labor market. So when you have consumer confidence fall off this sharply, along with all of these other measures, and even the Fed talking about it in its Beige Book about how scattered reports of layoffs are popping up, what that suggests is that consumers are telling you something, and even the Federal Reserve is telling you something about the condition and the transition potential in the U.S. labor market and the overall economy. The flat part of the beverage curve may actually be emerging, and that's the last thing that we want to see. That's the information that we're getting from all these various sources, not just the Fed, but I mean, look at just the Fed stuff. We get to the information showing sharp loss of economic momentum that is impacting the entire economy, services, manufacturing, not just one region or another, in a way that looks like a developing full-blown recession, a possible transition from the vertical part of the beverage curve to the flat part of the beverage curve. If we were heading into a full-blown, full-scale recession, and we were transitioning from the vertical part to the flat part, this is exactly what it would look like. It would look like the Federal Reserve talking about, in January, rare reports of layoffs, to April, scattered reports of layoffs, for PMIs that are suggesting sharp drop-off in activity and an even greater drop-off in sentiment and future perceptions, all of these things being consistent with that transformation and transition. And in addition to all of that, these negative comparisons down around 2020 lows, it's the same thing that we're getting from the marketplace. As I said yesterday and the day before here on YouTube, that's what the markets have been saying as far as from the perspective of interest rates that go lower and stay there. This is what it would look like if we were moving in that direction. And more, that's what all the information says, that we are moving in that direction, and we may be further along in that process than many people realize. Not at the Federal Reserve, though. This is far from a US-specific issue. We've seen the same potential transition show up in many places around the rest of the world, including those like South Korea. South Korea just posted some concerning economic numbers and went over those in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.